And today's lecture is actually on pollution. And by the end of this class, you guys should be able to explain different types of pollution, describe the ecological impacts of different pollution sources, compare and contrast approaches to regulating and controlling pollution, including the role of personal actions. So first up, we'll talk a little bit about the sources of pollution. And one of the main sources of pollution is actually industrial. One of the critical ways in which industrial pollution really became an issue was through acid rain. And acid rain is generated because we have nitrogen and sulfur, which produce nitric and sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. These are produced through industrial processes. These, where's my pointer gone? Yeah, these acidic gases, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, are released into the atmosphere. The gas is then carried by the wind. The gases then dissolve in rainwater to form this acid rain, which falls down the land. And this acid rain kills plant life, pollutes rivers, streams and roads networks. This was a major source of industrial pollution. In addition, we have mining and heavy metals. One of the biggest examples of this is the gigantic mine that's in central southern Utah. It is the world's largest hole, which is quite a big claim to fame. And the process of mining often releases dust and things into the atmosphere, but crucially, it's also a major source of heavy metals. And heavy metals are not things like Iron Maiden, but actually things like copper, lead, and selenium. These are metals which get released during the process of mines extracting dirt from the floor. Those metals can end up running off into rivers and end up in lakes, and it's one of the reasons why, for example, there is a consumption advisory on birds, like waterfowl that you might want to shoot and eat in the Great Salt Lake wetlands, because the Kennecott mine has dumped so many heavy metals into that ecosystem that there's high levels of mercury present inside those birds, and if you eat too many of them, it can give you quite a serious nasty. Another source of industrial pollution is actually spills. So some of these images are shown here. So this is the Exxon Valdez. This used to be the world's biggest oil spill. It happened up in Alaska, in a very pristine part of the world. It was an oil tanker that was absolutely chock full of Alaskan oil, and it unfortunately ran aground. It ended up stricken, and it started to release its oil into the ocean itself. I say it used to be the world's biggest oil spill because it was overtaken a few years ago by the Deepwater Horizon explosion. There are some discussions about whether or not the Deepwater Horizon or the Chernobyl incident that we talked about previously. There's a big discussion about which one of those is the world's largest accident. I suspect it's Chernobyl, but Deepwater Horizon comes a pretty close second. This sort of oil spill and oil getting into the natural environment is not an entirely ocean-based thing. It does also happen very locally. So, for example, there was a large diesel spill in Willard Bay in 2014 that, as it says here, was much worse than previously thought. This was due to a pipeline going pop, and it was owned by Chevron. The regulators told them they could not restart this diesel pipeline at Willard Bay until they say so. If you look at what happened, by the time this news article came out, the pipeline had already spit out more than 21,000 gallons of diesel right near the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. So this was a really serious incident, and it happened very locally. In addition, some of the other sources of pollution that have a serious impact are from agriculture. So especially around here in Cache County, we have an awful lot of pollution running into our rivers and waterways. These are things something like herbicides and pesticides. So herbicides and pesticides are chemicals that are added to the landscape with the intention of directly killing weeds or insects. These, of course, run off and they end up in waterways again, or they end up in adjacent terrestrial ecosystems. In addition to herbicides and pesticides, we also have nutrient runoff. Nutrient runoff can come in multiple different sources. For example, cattle feedlots. This is the cattle feedlot that's just on the way out of town near Gossamer's Foods. This feedlot, any feedlot the poop and pee that comes out of the cows, that's got a really high concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. That runs off and it can end up in adjacent ecosystems and in the waterways. That's why we get these big harmful algal blooms in places like Utah Lake. In addition, we can get nutrient runoff due to fertilizer being added in arable farming. Both of these mean we have excess nutrients in natural ecosystems, which can lead to problems down the line. Also, we get sources of urban pollution from urban areas. One of the big ones of these is stormwater runoff. So whenever we get storms happening, rainstorms, snowmelt, things like that, when that lands on urban areas, especially non-porous surfaces such as roadways and pavements, it ends up going down the drains. As it's running along these pavements, it's picking up all the pollutants that are present in this system. So, for example, this can be things like oil, as we see here, also bits of tyre, bits of rubber, other various chemicals. Generally, it leads to very, very polluted water entering natural systems. In addition to stormwater runoff, we also get wastewater runoff. This is stuff that comes out of, let's say, sewer systems and all the other various nastinesses. This is very well treated, but it does still contain some pollution. When we then look at what the actual impacts are, well, the impacts of acid rain were quite dramatic. So remember, this is acid rain where we have industrial processes releasing sulfur and nitrogen into the atmosphere, and this then returns back and falls as acid rain. What you tend to find is in lakes and river systems, especially where a lot of this stuff ends up, we get decreased pH in much the same way as we talked about with ocean acidification, but we also get increased aluminium, which is a really nasty pollutant. If you have a look at the tolerances of some of these species, shown down here, on this figure here, we've got all the different species listed, and going in this direction, whether they're present at different pHs. What we can find is that some species can actually survive relatively low pHs. So, for example, frogs, we still find them in some water bodies, even when the pH is as low as 4. However, as the pH, as we start at ambient conditions and we increase acidity, we get species dropping out in order. For example, we lose clams and snails. Remember in the ocean acidification lecture, we talked about how the calcium carbonate skeletons of clams and snails are very, very susceptible to changes in pH. These are lost first. Then we start to lose crayfish, mayflies and bass. Then we lose salamanders and trout. Then we lose perch. And finally, all we have left is our frogs. So as we increase acidity, leading to reduced pH, individual species drop out of our ecosystems. One of the other impacts we get on ecosystems is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation and biomagnification are subtly different processes, and we'll talk through them, but they must appreciate the two are not exactly the same. Bioaccumulation refers to increased concentrations of pollutants inside the bodies of an individual organism as it goes through time. So let's take the example of these 3 fish here. So when these 3 fish are babies, they have no pollutants in them at all. However, as they grow and they're alive in a particular ecosystem, they're continuously ingesting food that contains a pollutant, and those pollutants remain present in their body. So for example, this little fish, they start off with none. By the time they reach this age, they've got this much pollutant in their body. This is because they've been eating organisms and they're accumulating a pollutant. As they get bigger, they're not expelling the pollutants, and the pollutants are building up inside their bodies. By the time they get to full size, the concentration of pollutants within inside their body has gotten really high. We often see bioaccumulation in chemicals that are what we call fat soluble, but not water soluble. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, the fat soluble, not water soluble. What this means is when these chemicals enter your body, they bind to the fatty tissues inside your body, and because they're not water soluble, you don't excrete them. They remain present in your fat forever. A big example of this is methyl mercury. Methylmercury is present in natural ecosystems at very low concentrations, but it binds to fat tissue. That means if you eat something that contains a bit of methylmercury, it binds to the fat inside your system that you're producing, and it never leaves your body. So every piece of methylmercury that you ever eat is still present in your body now, until you lose an awful lot of weight. This sort of bioaccumulation means that through time, the amount of pollutant within inside an organism is increasing as it's acquiring more pollution during its lifetime. This is bioaccumulation. Biomagnification is similar but works slightly differently. Because the way biomagnification works is the magnification of pollutants inside food chains. So what we do is we start at the very bottom of the food chain with our little plankton. They have very, very, very low levels of pollutant, but that pollutant remains present inside their body. When these plankton get eaten by their predators, in this case a fish, all of the pollutants that are present inside these zooplankton are then ingested by the fish and remain present inside the fish's body. When these fish are then eaten by, in this case, a sea lion, all the pollution that's present inside these fish is then transferred into the sea lion. And then when the sea lion is eaten by a polar bear, all of the pollutant that's present inside the sea lion is then put into the polar bear. So what this means is the amount of pollutant is magnified as you move up the food chain. One of the main areas that this is seen is actually, again, methylmercury in the oceans, because in the oceans, in this figure here, there are four different trophic levels in this food chain. In some ocean systems, as many as 7 trophic levels. And every time you move up a trophic level, the amount of pollutant present increases by a factor of 10. So this is because if you look at phytoplankton, so the tiny little plankton that exist in the open oceans, the amount of pollutant that's present in their tissues is exactly the same as the surrounding water. So that means 1 kilogram of phytoplankton contains the same amount of pollution as 1 kilogram of water. However, when these phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton, all of the pollutant that was in the tissues of the phytoplankton is then transferred into the zooplankton. What you then find is the amount of pollutant inside the phytoplankton is 10 times higher than it is in the ambient seawater. These phytoplankton are then eaten by small fish, and that again magnifies it by 10. These small fish are eaten by bigger fish, that again magnifies it by 10. These slightly bigger fish are eaten by bigger fish, which again magnifies it by 10, and so on and so on and so on. What this means is, if you look specifically at top predators like tuna in the open ocean, the amount of pollutant in 1 kilogram of tuna flesh is the same amount that's present in 1 million kilograms of seawater, because the pollutant has been magnified through the food chain. So just to sum up, bioaccumulation, where's my pointer gone? Bioaccumulation is the accumulation of pollutants inside a single individual through time. So as that individual goes about its day-to-day habits through its life, it's continuously accumulating pollutants. Biomagnification is the magnification of pollutants as we move up food chains. Okay, so this is within an individual, whereas biomagnification is going up food chains. So we need to remember that little difference between them. In addition, we can look at the impacts of ecosystems. One of the pollutants on ecosystems, one of the big ones of these was legacy effects. And one of the biggest examples of this, and also success stories, was actually chlorofluorocarbons and the ozone layer. And chlorofluorocarbons have been a persistent pollutant. None of you are old enough to, I suspect, remember the big issue with chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. CFCs were the propellant that used to be used in all aerosols. So all of that stuff that was going on during the 80s, when we were using enormous amounts of hairspray, all of those aerosols were using CFCs as the propellant inside them. The problem with those CFCs is when they got into the atmosphere, they went up into the higher reaches of the atmosphere, and they started to dissolve the ozone layer. And the ozone layer is a layer that surrounds the Earth and is very important for keeping out some of the Earth's harmful UV radiation. So in this figure down here, it shows what the consequence of these CFCs were. So this is this colour chart gives you the amount of ozone in Dobson units. So purple is incredibly low, red is very, very high, green is intermediate. So we can see in 1979, and we're looking here at the South Pole, 1979, there was slightly less ozone on the South Pole than there was everywhere else, but generally ozone layers are pretty high. By the 80s, ozone layers had really dropped. By the 90s, we actually had this massive hole in the ozone layer. And this was still present in 2008. And if we look at what actually happened was, as we move through time on this chart here, and then we've got the minimum amount of ozone. So the ozone was dropping above the Antarctica, and in the mid-80s, we enacted what was called the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol banned the use of CFCs and aerosols globally. It's like, no, you're not having any more. However, even after CFCs were banned, it continuously dropped, and it didn't start recovering until the 2000s, nearly 15 years later. The reason for that was the legacy effects of these chlorofluorocarbons. When these CFCs got into the atmosphere, they were incredibly stable, and they destroyed the ozone layer, but they weren't destroyed themselves in the chemical reaction. They actually acted as a catalyst. What this meant was one molecule of CFC could keep on destroying multiple molecules of ozone for anything up to 15 years. So as a result, even though we banned CFCs, their legacy effects persisted for another 15 years. What's interesting is this has been a big success story because now the ozone layer has actually recovered quite a bit. So it's a lovely example of when we had this global problem, the entire world banded together to help fix it, and we've actually started to make things a lot better. When we look at some of the other impacts, so for example, impacts in ecosystems generated by agricultural pollutions, one of the really bad things that's happened with agriculture has been the production of oceanic dead zones. So this illustration here, this shows the watershed, the catchment area of the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River runs all through the West and the Midwest. This is a huge agricultural area. This whole region is the breadbasket of America. It's where we get an awful lot of our crops. Now what's happening is all of the fertilizer and all of the nutrient runoff that's taking place in this entire watershed, all across the US and even reaching up into Canada, all of this nutrient runoff is making its way into the various rivers. It eventually ends up in the main stem of the Mississippi, and all of this extra nutrients is then dumped into the Gulf of Mexico just here. What this is doing is creating eutrophication, as we observed in something like Utah Lake a couple of lectures ago, but it's doing it on a massive oceanic scale. So rather than affecting a single lake, it's now affecting an entire region of the ocean. And what it's doing is it's increasing algal blooms. Those algal blooms are reducing the amount of oxygen and creating what we call bottom water dissolved oxygen dead zones. So in this image here, we have oxygen concentrations in the water in the Gulf of Mexico. Yellow is high, red is very, very low. We've actually started to develop this big dead, well actually yellow isn't low, yellow isn't high, yellow is still low. The blue is ambient, but it's just not as low as it could be. So we've generated this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico where fish can't survive because the oxygen levels have dropped so low, and it's a consequence of agricultural pollution all through the Mississippi Basin. One of the weird things that happened due to urban ecosystems has been urban ecosystems not only produce stormwater runoff and oil, but they also produce endocrine disruptors. What that's led to is what we call intersex fish. Endocrine disruptors monkey about with the reproductive capacity of different organisms. Fish can actually switch sexes relatively easily because the males produce sperm and the females produce eggs. but switching from one to the other is not massively difficult. So because we're putting all these endocrine disruptors into the ocean, into the water, it's generating intersex fish. So if you look at in this table here, the percentage of fish with testicular oocytes. Oocytes are egg-producing cells. So this is the percentage of fish with egg-producing cells in their testes, which you might notice is a bit wrong. Some of these incidences are huge. For example, in the spring, in this one location where it's tested, 100% of the male fish that were tested were producing eggs. So that's pretty staggering and can seriously affect the reproductive capacity of these populations. Because the pollution can have serious impacts, there have been an awful lot of mitigation measures put into place. One of the strongest has been hardcore regulation. So one of the real things that generated clean water, a piece of regulation came into place called the Clean Water Act, which happened in 1972. And the Clean Water Act restricted discharge of pollutants and toxins into the navigable waters of the US, making them fishable and swimmable. So prior to the Clean Water Act 1972, any industrial activity, when it wanted to get rid of their waste products, they could literally just put a pipe into the nearest river and dump their stuff. That meant every chemical plant, every refinery, anyone could just dump their waste they produced straight into a river and say, right, it's done, it's fixed. Following the Clean Water Act of 1972, that massively restricted the discharge of pollutants and toxins into rivers, meaning that industry really had to clean its act up. So that's led to these various things. So for example, this is the Nashua River. Before the Clean Water Act, you'll notice it's almost blood red. It is absolutely full of heavy metal toxins. After the Clean Water Act, it's now a lovely place to be, and you can go paddling, kayaking, you can even swim in it, people fish in it, it's recovered, and it's all very well and good. Another great example is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. This is the river before the Clean Water Act. It used to literally have a layer of deadly slime floating on the top of it, and just look at all the waste floating down the river. This river, prior to the Clean Water Act, was so polluted, and it had so many deadly chemicals in it, that at one point it actually set on fire. So this is the river on fire. Now, I'm not really an expert on pollution, but if your river is on fire, something has gone seriously wrong. If you look at that same river now, after the Clean Water Act, again, it's used for boating, it can be used for recreational activities, and it's generally an awful lot cleaner. This idea of a Clean Water Act is not unique to the US. In the United Kingdom, we also have one. So United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, we also have one. This had to be put into place because the Thames, the main river that runs through London, was so incredibly poisonous at one point. The Thames, because it's in the middle of London, it's a very large river, has often had pleasure cruises running up and down it for about the last 200 years. In the late 19th century, these pleasure cruises that went up and down the Thames did not issue their guests with life jackets because the river itself was so poisonous, if you fell into the river, you would be poisoned and die. It wouldn't matter if you were going to drown or not, because just being in the river was going to kill you anyway. As a result, there's no point in having life jackets. So this sort of Clean Water Act, this sort of regulation, has really helped clean up the rivers of the world. In addition, we've had the Clean Air Act in 1970. The Clean Air Act massively restricted the abilities of industry to put particulate matter, nitrogen, sulfur, and volatile organic carbons into the atmosphere. So on this figure here, we have the x-axis on the bottom that shows us time. On the y-axis, we have emissions in terms of millions of short tons. This was when the Clean Air Act was invoked. And you can see prior to the Clean Air Act, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter were increasing in the atmosphere, as was nitrous oxide. When the Clean Air Act came in, all of these have now started to decay. If we actually look at the effect this has had through time, and especially when we're looking at acid rain. Here on the x-axis again we have time. Remember, all of this is after the Clean Air Act. But this is at Big Moose Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. We look at sulfur oxides, they've gone down. We look at nitrous oxides, they've gone down. We look at the ANC in equation per litres equivalent, that's gone up. And most crucially, pH started to go up again. What this increase in pH means, we've had a decrease in sulfur dioxide, a decrease in nitrous oxide. That has led to a decrease in the production of sulfuric and nitric acid in the atmosphere. The reduction of these acids has started to increase the pH as we're moving away from acid rain. In addition to straight regulation, we also have economic incentives. One of the biggest examples of this was cap and trade, and showed how cap and trade works. What cap and trade means is, so for any single industry, you have the amount of emissions that you put out. These are now capped. Every single industry gets an allowance, they get a permit, which tells you how much of this stuff you can produce. If you manage, so here is the cap, if you manage to reduce your emissions so they're at a level below the cap, you can then actually sell your permitted allowance to another industry and that is going over the cap, and so it becomes a tradable commodity. This actually has happened in a few places, and it works quite well. It essentially means if you reduce pollution, you can sell the potential pollution to another industry, and as a result make some money. Cap and trade had serious success reducing sulfur oxide and acid rain. So here we have going through time, and here we have the different colours relate to the different parts of cap and trade. So this was just straight restriction. At this point they started putting in actual cap and trade, and you can see both the pH and the amount of sulfur getting released into the atmosphere decreased. If we look at that on a spatial scale, this is the amount of acid rain through sulfur oxides that were getting produced between 1989 and 1991. After cap and trade, look at the massive amount of reduction. Green is good, red is bad. Look, all the way through. Remember, this is the Rust Belt state. This is the Rust Belt state, Pennsylvania, where they make all the iron and fun things like that. Look how much it was generating, how much sulfur oxide is generating in 89 to 91. Look how much it was reduced. We still have those hot spots, but the overall reduction is huge. One of the other things we do is economic incentives, and we actually one of the ways that we do that is carbon taxes and taxes on production of fossil fuels. So in the red, we have all the different states that generate, so all of these values here describe the amount of tax revenue that is generated through the production of fossil fuels. This is the top 10 states. You'll see that one of the big ones is Wyoming. Wyoming has no state income tax and no state property taxes because the vast majority of its tax actually comes from taxing the fossil fuel industries. This is what these sort of taxes are placed sometimes on individuals and also sometimes on the industry itself. In addition, many countries have what's affectionately known as a carbon tax. This is a tax you have to pay whenever you purchase fuel, such as gasoline, coal or natural gas, for your own personal use. Many countries have put these in, Canada, the US, the UK, but there's only one country that's not only put one in, but then also repealed it, so taken it away again, and that was Australia. And if you look at Australia actually put its carbon tax in as one of the first nations. So on the x-axis we have time, y-axis we have emissions. Australia put in the carbon tax, and emissions continuously dropped. Then they actually repealed, they got rid of the carbon tax, and emissions shot back up again. So it turns out, yes, putting a carbon tax on does massively reduce emissions through an economic incentive without needing to regulate. Other mitigation measures that have taken place are improved wastewater treatments. One of the most spectacular examples of this is nutrient treatment that's taken place in the Chesapeake Bay watershed on the eastern seaboard. So on this figure here, on the x-axis we have time. The blue is total phosphorus, and the red is flow. So how much wastewater is coming out of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. What we see is, starting in 1913, so we had a big increase in industrialization. Starting in 1913, the amount of wastewater goes up a lot. Now, when it first increased, that wastewater was associated with a huge increase in the amount of phosphorus coming out of the Chesapeake watershed at the same time. However, starting in the 70s, the Chesapeake Bay watershed implemented a really big program to start removing phosphorus from its wastewater. They started treating its wastewater. What they were able to do was, at first the phosphorus went up due to industrial activity, then they started to remove it, and this massively decreased the amount of phosphorus coming out in the wastewater, even though the amount of wastewater was still going up. So what that means is, in this area, in the same situation today, phosphorus loads in the Chesapeake Bay watershed are below, way below the levels in the early 1910s, despite the fact we've had a massive increase in flow. So even though we've got a huge increase in wastewater flow, we've still got very, very low levels of phosphorus. And this is critical if we're going to do things like get rid of the open ocean dead zones that we see in the Gulf of Mexico coming out of the Mississippi. First of all, they did phosphorus, then subsequently they also did nitrogen. So if you look here, again, we're looking at the Chesapeake Bay. Here's through time. The red is the actual wastewater flow. The blue, in this case, is total nitrogen. We see that it did pulse a little bit, but it sort of kept pace with flow until the late 90s. Then they put in new extreme measures to reduce nitrogen in the wastewater. So even though flow has stayed high, the amount of nitrogen has dropped down an awful lot. When we look at agriculture, some of the mitigation measures we use in agriculture, we have agricultural best management practices, or BMPs. Some of these are things like cover cropping or riparian buffers. One of the things that's been really important to reduce the impact of agricultural pollution on water sources in the US has been the production of riparian buffers. So on this picture here, this is taken from Google Earth. This is a large agricultural area. These are all basically the arable crop fields, and we can see they're very obviously arable crop fields. This is a river that runs through the landscape, and you can see all around this river, this dark green is forest, riparian vegetation that is allowed to grow adjacent to the river. What this riparian vegetation buffer means that any wastewater and nutrient runoff coming off this agricultural landscape is intercepted by the riparian buffer. That riparian buffer soaks up an awful lot of those nutrients and prevents them from entering the waterways. Also, one of the other great mitigation features is well-functioning ecosystems. If you have ecosystems that are generally functioning and healthy, they're often able to mitigate the effects of pollution. One of the most staggering incidences of this was actually what was known as the hero beavers of Willard Bay. So after that diesel spill that we talked about earlier on, beavers that were present on the landscape, they were placed all over the place. Their dams that they built were able to intercept parts of the flow and reduce the impact on the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. In addition, we also have lots of personal actions. So what we do on our day-to-day life also massively impacts what happens around the world. So for example, reducing plastic in our day-to-day life means that less plastic ends up entering the oceans. Also ensuring we recycle things and don't throw things away. One of the really nasty bits of pollution that we might not even think about is our cell phones. The vast majority of all the cell phones in the world that are recycled end up in this area of West Africa. So this one little country down here is the #1 cell phone recycling place, and has totally changed the entire economy from one dependent on subsistence fishing to recycling. Okay, so at the end of this class, you guys should now be able to explain different types of pollution in our water, describe the ecological impact of different pollution sources, compare and contrast approaches to regulating and controlling pollution, including the use of personal actions. Thank you, and I'll see you later.